We are indeed very privileged to have both of our guest speakers today. The first is Cassandra Wilkinson. Cass is very well known. In fact, even my wife has called me in when she appears on TV, typically Sky TV. Cass is an author, commentator, columnist and co-founder and chair of FBI FM, Sydney's Australian music radio station. She is the director of several charities and has held executive roles in the public and private sectors. She writes regularly for the Australian newspaper and appears frequently on television, including the Bolt Report, the Sky News Agenda and The Drum, where she discusses current events in politics and society. Her book, Don't Panic, Nearly Everything is Better Than You Think, argued that the world is getting better. And Cass has also contributed essays to several books on well-being, welfare reform, and most recently was featured in the anthology of Best Australian Science Writing 2012, published by UNSW Press. She may have books available for signing or sale, maybe. So Cass has been a guest speaker at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which I think is held at the Opera House, the Battle of Ideas UK, Concilium, Liberty and Society, the Hugo Group Annual Conference in New Zealand, the Future Summit, and the Genius of Western Civilization Conference. We are humbled that she should address the Liberal Democratic Party here today. So would you please join with me in welcoming Cass to the podium.
I must say, I certainly, it's terribly good manners to suggest that people might be humbled that I would turn up here, but I've got to say, I feel likewise humbled to be among a bunch of people starting your own political party. It's there are challenges in being part of a large political party, which I've enjoyed and been frustrated by over the years, but there's very few people in this country who actually have the guts and discipline and imagination to start a new movement. And I guess the reason that I'm here today and really happy to be with you is because even though I've spent my life in a different political party, the need right now for libertarian movements is greater than I think it has been for the last 100 years or so. There are, at the moment, I guess, a number of things that we might differ on, although John is schooling me gradually and re-educating me. But I think the things that we have in common are the ones that all of us need to focus on, whether it's you guys in the LDP, or those of us who are more freedom-minded in other parties, or people joining groups like the Taxpayers Alliance and some of the other anti-nanny state and pro-freedom groups that are popping up at the moment, which is great to see. And I think that I was thinking about what to talk about today, and almost everything fell into the kind of category of teaching your mum to suck eggs at this point. I thought coming here and talking to you guys about how important freedom is probably going to be not the best use of all of our time, given that you've given it enough concern to start your own party. But I thought I might talk to you a little bit, if I can today, about a book that I'm finishing at the moment, which I hope will be out in May, which is about kids. And about the fact that in the last couple of years, all of these people trying to ban butter and ban riding with no bike helmets and trying to ban everything that kids do for fun and get involved in junk food in schools and advertising on TV for bad foods and getting rid of the Paddle Pop Lion and the toucan on the Fruit Loops carton, keep telling us that this will be the first generation of kids that grows up less healthy than their parents. And while I think a lot of the logic behind that's pretty flawed and self-serving, I think what is actually true is that if those people succeed, this will be the first generation of kids who grow up less free than their parents. When I think about the freedoms that my dad and his generation got for themselves, they might not all be everybody's top-ranking freedoms, but the people in the 60s and 70s and my parents' generation managed to repeal most of the Summary Offences Act that got greater civil liberties, including when I was a kid in Queensland, we went from having no right to demonstrate, and as a little kid in the rallies during the Sequeb dispute and other things, I remember people being arrested simply for demonstrating, which is no longer an offence. There are reductions in censorship, bans of books, bans of records, all kinds of, I guess, printed and recorded material, and not so much, I wouldn't care particularly if films like Salo were never shown again, but the fact that films like that have been made available, I guess, is at the far end of a broad and very positive movement for having less government censorship about what we read and watch, and which led to a great deal more cultural freedom, certainly greater sexual liberty, abortion, contraceptive rights, gay rights, and however they may have gone too far, the early anti-discrimination laws, I think. So we kind of think about how much that generation achieved in terms of improving its freedoms. And then I think about what's happening to my kids' generation. Just a snapshot over the last 2 years, Armidale Primary School banned running, Albany Primary School banned playing on the grass, Belgian Gardens and Drummoyne Primary School both banned cartwheels and handstands, Mornington Peninsula Primary School banned hugging and gave a 6-year-old detention for doing it. Parents and teachers complained about excessive hugging and felt the behaviour was getting out of control and becoming disruptive. Mount Martha Primary banned all contact sports, any physical contact, tiggy, hugging and high fives. New Farm banned tiggy, Red Rover, and suggested that children try board games instead. Carlton Gardens banned running, removed its monkey bars. St Michael's banned football and soccer. St Peter's Primary School banned tackling and ball games. Ascot Vale banned all rough games. A whole bunch of schools in Sydney banned running games, and the Victorian and New South Wales Departments of Education have put broad bans on roundabouts, flying foxes, seesaws and monkey bars. The ACT put in a new risk management policy that nearly shut down school swimming days until it was overturned. And the Queensland Government put in a new risk management policy that nearly saw swimming lessons abandoned in state schools until parents sensibly had them overturn it again. All of which has led me to have a look at whether any of this is actually a reasonable response to what's dangerous for children. And it won't surprise anyone in this room, I'm sure, that in actual fact, despite what the AMA and the organised groups of academics and safety campaigners are telling us, injuries among children have been stable or falling in every category since 1999. Broadly over the last 30 years, kids have been safer from death and injury from almost every cause except for willfully neglectful parenting, which is a terrible thing, but it's not something that you can. Those deaths can't then be used to justify incursions into the parenting decisions of average people, which is increasingly what's been happening. Certainly, there isn't any cause of injury that's out of control, worse than ever, or a growing concern for kids. Continuing what genuinely continues to keep killing kids is drowning. So the only really stupid thing that schools are doing at the moment is preventing kids from learning to swim. And perversely, fear of drowning is stopping kids from learning to swim, which is currently, as we know, the only known cure for drowning. And so if the rules are not actually about safety, you start to wonder, well, what are they for? If none of these rules are keeping our kids any safer, then all we're actually doing is making rules against freedom. And what we're doing to our kids is not keeping them safe, but keeping them quiet, keeping them complacent, keeping them from exercising their own judgment. And when you look at who's been doing this, it does start to make me feel a bit nervous about, we had a lot of fun during the Clinton era hearing about vast right-wing conspiracies. I think what we have here is a sort of vast, well-meaning left-wing conspiracy of academics, public servants, health professionals and sections of the media who are, in the guise of trying to take care of our children, actually enfeebling the next generation of citizens and training them to be afraid of freedom and afraid of exercising their own judgments. These changes that have happened in school playgrounds and in local government playgrounds none of them have been by accident. They represent changes to Australian standards and to risk and liability rules, all of which have been made by people. So every time someone says, oh, well, that principal in that school who banned running games, well, they're just making a decision at the local level. Actually, they're implementing policies that are set by ministers, governments, department heads, which don't tolerate injury, which continually settle ridiculous claims by parents who are suing schools for basic, normal, resilience-building injuries that used to be considered part of normal, healthy growing up. And when I think back to the way that I grew up, particularly the years that I spent in Brisbane as a kid, I start to feel like I went to that island where the wild things were, and I worry very much that unless we can put some wildness back into the childhoods that our kids are going to have, a child who doesn't have the courage and self-confidence to walk home from school, to participate in rough games, to climb trees. Climbing any tree with a height over 50 millimetres is not recommended by KidSafe, by the way. 50 Sorry, my apologies. 500 millimetres, 50 centimetres, 500 millimetres. 50 millimetres would be crazy, right? So 50 centimetres, so literally knee high, even for me, and I'm not that tall. So, and I worry that those kids won't be kids who'll think, you know what? I don't know if I want to work for someone else, maybe I'm going to start my own business. Or maybe there is a way to cure cancer if I think hard enough and have confidence in myself. Or, you know, I really think that I'd like to go and explore a wild place or climb a mountain. And, you know, when we think about how this country was built by people who went out looking for resources under the ground, built by people who went out and ploughed fields in places where there was bushland, and people who weren't afraid to get dirty and hurt and disappointed and go broke or ask other people to help them do mad things. How many people will have that kind of courage if they can't climb higher than 50 centimetres off the ground without adult assistance? So what this is really, even worse than being a war on kids, it's actually a war on freedom. And I think back, I read a while ago, there's a great debate on the Hansard records when they were thinking about where to put the capital of Australia. And many people spoke in favour of Bombala, which I hadn't been aware of before. And the speeches in favour of Bombala are actually quite moving and really worth the read, because what's discussed there is the building of a great capital with the industry of Chicago, with the beauty of Paris, with the enterprise of New York. You've got to read these things. And what it tells you is that there was a time when Australians believed that we would be among the biggest, most powerful, leading free nations of the world, that we would set an example for the whole planet, that we would be protectors of freedom and enterprise and the human drive for prosperity and innovation, that Australia would be essentially a new America. And that kind of thinking seems to have been chased away now by over-concern for having a light footprint. And lately, I see the forces of freedom have been able to ban super trawlers, leading to people losing their jobs and investments in fishing, not changing the quotas, by the way, so you can still take as many fish out, but you just have to do it more expensively. So, and of course the live export bans, I'm seeing plenty of people lose their jobs in the cattle industry. You see the anti-coal seam gas movement putting a whole lot of people's livelihoods at risk. And, you know, the organising skills of the movements around our country at the moment who are promoting less freedom are quite breathtaking. So the broad, you know, whether it's broad-based campaigns like the ones that Get Up runs, things like gay marriage, or small campaigns against things like live exports, we're seeing people who are demanding greater government intervention are getting stronger all the time, better organised, making great use of social media and cheaper campaigning techniques. And what we don't have so much of is those of us who have been getting on with our own lives, not so much being part of those groups, I think, partly because people of our persuasion tend to be more individualistic, more self-reliant, less usually belonging to large organised groups, but we're now in a position where if we don't organise a little as well, I fear we will get overwhelmed by them because of their skill at appropriating government resources to do their work for them, which I think is something obviously all of you are concerned about, or you wouldn't be devoting all of your time to putting this party together. You know, and I think that when we look at what's happened in terms of the change in the country since people dreamed of a great capital in Bombala, the idea that the vast majority of Australians would take care of themselves, that a few genuinely needy people would have a helping hand, that a few problems would warrant government intervention, thinking much like that captured in your policy documents, has been replaced with an idea that everyone, with few exceptions, is in the government handout machine at some point. You know, average families paying their own bills and mortgages, perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, are now on these family tax benefit B payments and childcare payments and back to school payments, and it's not only a waste of money, it's that it trains people in the habit of looking to government to solve problems, looking to government to pay for things, looking for government to show the way. And obviously, again, not something anyone here would fail to see, is that in the end, government doesn't have its own ideas most of the time. Government gathers ideas from around the community, picks and chooses, and implements whatever seems to fit its purposes on the day. And the problem is if government gets too big, it runs out of other people on whom to depend for both ideas and the capital to implement them. You know, and I think when I used to come along to talks a bit like this, you know, we used to say, well, first they came for the smokers and nobody cared because it bloody well stinks, right? But it's now at the point where you can joke for a couple of moments about the trivial impositions that are happening to freedoms, the fact that you can't buy a round of drinks anymore in Sydney because that's binge drinking, problem drinking, rather than an act of basic generosity and good social training. But now we're in a situation where the New South Wales government is talking about ramping up the anti-vilification laws because they've decided that no one getting sued proves the laws aren't strong enough, rather than maybe thinking nothing warranted prosecuting anybody for. On top of which, obviously, the federal government's looking at the Finkelstein inquiry. And once you get to the point where the right to silence is under discussion, as it is at the moment for watering down, if you're removing basic protections, and while the left has been good at pointing out the ASIO powers and the problems with having people remanded without trial under the ASIO powers, there's actually a whole lot of creeping powers around the place, not least the New South Wales Crime Commission, and there are coercive powers in standing bodies which are not being discussed. On top of that, you start regulating the media and putting government censorship back in, and I think, well, if my parents' generation allowed, you know, essentially forced government to take the censorship off, well, we're standing around watching them put it back on again, and the lack of outrage seems to be extraordinary at the moment. And what's worse is that same generation and largely same group of people who argued against censorship seem to be the ones sitting in the universities and pontificating from large sections of the media, demanding the reintroductions of a whole lot of censorship that they themselves argued against 30 years ago. So I suppose it means at the moment, particularly with the press regulation, and I hope the Liberal Party is sincere in saying that it won't touch press regulation, but it will take some courage for them not to do it, given the pressure that's mounting at the moment. There simply couldn't be a more important time for a party like yours to be making its presence felt. And in a way, I guess I'm looking for a little free rider benefit, since I belong to a party that, when I joined it, was liberalising the economy and liberalising a great deal of society, but the the major parties, both Labor and Liberal, keep drifting back towards a big government solution to every kind of problem. And whether it's Labor drifting leftward and statist or the Liberals drifting conservative and statist, I think there are a great many people in my party and the Liberals and others who really are looking for more, for the debate to be dragged back towards a more liberal perspective, a more genuinely liberal libertarian perspective. So there will be plenty of people who might not agree enough with everything that you're on about to join, but I think there'll be more and more of us who wish you well, and many more and more of us who will find ways to help where we can, because your mission at the moment is absolutely vital. And I think it can be very, being involved in politics when you're not winning is depressing enough when you win from time to time. I imagine it's an enormous challenge when you are small and don't win very often, but the results recently in local government elections show that at least you have your foot on that first rung of the ladder, and I think that's a tremendous achievement for everyone here. So thank you so much for including me in your discussions today.
Thanks, Cass. And time permitting, you're prepared to answer some few questions or supplement your
yes.
talk? Clinton, up the back.
Yeah, I won't go on too much about how much I agree with you, but everyone here does. The things you said about not being able to climb a 50 centimetre tree, well, if you can't do that, well, can you start your own political party? And that's what I'm concerned about in the future as well. Maybe we're a dying breed, people will just accept Labor in the future, they can't even climb a 50 centimetre tree. But I don't know how to ask this nicely, so I'll be a bit blunt. Why are you in the Labor? And answers as an ex-Labor member, I don't particularly, I think out of the two majors, particularly at the moment, probably make a better choice. Not by much, they're pretty close. Considering how far you say the Abbott's going to conservative, I see Abbott going to the left on things like climate change, on maternity leave, that they say baby bonus is bad. He wants 75,000 baby bonus. So the two parties at the federal level are just, I can't pick them apart at the moment. So I'm not criticising your choice, particularly the Labor Party. I think the Labor Party a bit better because at least they seem to be more well-intentioned, whereas the Liberals just tend to get people who don't like us. I guess, is it just historic that's where you've been, or do you think there's any chance for Liberty to grow the Labor Party? Like I was a Labor Party member for about 2 years or so on and off. I never really saw a future for myself there. It was a good experience being in a major party, that's what I took from it. I never really picked a faction. In fact, the faction of the Labor Party ever seemed to go anywhere. What's your position there? Or maybe you're about to make an announcement next year.
No. As much as I'm a sucker for acts of theatre, and that would be very entertaining, I don't think John may continue working on my re-education, but I'm not there yet. I think when I joined in the early to mid-90s, the consensus was the Labor Party had become economic rationalist and drifted to the right and was inexorably going towards this so-called neoliberal, which suited me down to the ground. I thought that was great. I thought that's the party for me, tariff reductions and opening up the economy and all of that sort of thing. But what's turned out to be the case is that parties ebb and flow, that individuals can make a difference to the quality of debate and thinking, and that unfortunately there aren't that many small government advocates, as you say, in either major party at the moment, and not even any of the minor parties. I mean, if you look at the Sex Party, even, who are kind of considered to be wild, crazy libertarian party, they're indistinguishable from the Greens on most policies. And what's always been difficult for me is, having spent most of my life in radio and contemporary music, young people desperate to be free, self-identifying as free and libertarian, keep voting Green and keep being drawn to a movement that they see as supporting their principles of sexual autonomy and drug legalisation or whatever, but not looking at any of the deeper, more social and economic economic issues around it. So I guess from my perspective, I joined for Paul Keating. I stayed because I married well. In the end, the Labor Party has its ups and downs, but it has produced a Peter Walsh from time to time. It has produced a Hawke and a Keating from time to time, and I certainly know a lot of people inside it who would like to turn the clock back to that sort of Button Hawke kind of era of thinking. And if I didn't think that wasn't possible, sorry, double negative, it's because I think that's still possible that I stay. But certainly in cases where Labor doesn't necessarily run a candidate, or where there isn't a direct conflict, I think it's a really positive thing to help out people who are committed to the causes which need greater support at the moment. We need that creative tension. And I mean, that's why I really enjoy doing work with the Taxpayers Alliance. I mean, we're not, people think of them as, oh, that's a Liberal Party group, but they're another libertarian group with as little as in common with the Libs as they do with the Labor Party.
Okay, we're going to have to cut it short because we've got, as Cass mentioned, we want to have talks from our elected officials. So I won't ask you to raise your blue slips, but would your acclamation show a vote of thanks to our guest speaker, Cassandra? I'll call on David to introduce our next guest speaker.
As an occasional writer myself, I have enormous admiration for Cass, and also envy the fact that she gets a terrific forum to get her ideas across. Half the battle is often getting a good forum. I'm also, on the same line, very pleased to introduce Brian Bedcoper. Brian's a doctor, graduated from the University of Sydney. He spent the bulk of his life as a family practitioner. He's also spent quite a lot of time in medico-political pursuits, most significantly as President of the Australian Medical Centres Association, for the last few years as President of Private Doctors of Australia. That's how I became familiar with his role. I was a member for a while. I subscribed to his magazine, which he wrote, most of which he wrote himself, and greatly admired what I read. He's written a lot on healthcare and related issues. As I said, he was editor of Australian Private Doctor for 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, and in 2009 authored Problems in Healthcare Delivery, Government as Cause, Not Cure. He left medical practice in 1997, disenchanted by increasing government intervention in the profession and the unwillingness of individual practitioners and medico-political organisations to make any useful or concerted attempt to stem the tide of market socialism. He'll be talking to us on healthcare delivery and possible libertarian approaches to them. Please welcome Brian.
Thanks, David, Peter, potential friends. I'm at considerable risk of telling you things that you already know, but as you heard, I'm going to make some comments about healthcare delivery in Australia. I should ask those three people that I've identified who listened to me at the Ludwig and Mises Institute convention recently to bear with me while I repeat many of those comments. As you would certainly know, healthcare delivery is in a mess in most countries in the Western world, and we too in Australia have a system that is in a constant state of disrepair because of high costs and poor performance. Of course, costs will always be a problem in a system in which politicians driven by interest groups and electoral opportunism can shower taxpayer money on whatever project takes their political fancy, when most hospitals are run by governments for the benefits of the unions that staff them, in any exchange to limit supply or demand or keep the transaction honest, when every expense, no matter how small, must be accompanied by a claim, when a large bureaucratic apparatus is required to monitor patients and doctors, and when government must oversee and control anything that could conceivably impact on costs. And while health professionals and politicians will deny that the quality of care is in decline, it is clear that there is a shortage of doctors and nurses, there's been an erosion of the skill base of most GPs, that infrastructure is inadequate, and that in an increasing number of instances the genuinely ill can no longer gain timely access to appropriate care. And when they do, they had better be very careful about the advice they accept. At least 10% of admissions to acute care hospitals are now associated with healthcare related harm, as are over 1 million general practice consultations each year. The greatest threat to quality care, however, is rapidly becoming the budgetary constraints that restrict access by patients to the best available treatments. Unsurprisingly, the reform process generally involves trying to reintroduce into the centralised delivery system some of the features that are characteristic of markets. In the latest rounds of reforms, this is meant to try and tighten the link between payment and performance for both doctors and hospitals. The public has also been promised more information about the performance of the various providers and that the system will be made more responsive to their needs. However, payment for performance in a centralised system still means that what is paid and the performance that was rewarded is determined by government. And a system based on the welfare of the collective simply cannot be responsible to individual needs. From the public health perspective, what is important is the total number of people who, for example, are obese or who smoke, and not the risk-benefit analysis for the individual. Competitive principles to lower costs and increase quality can never be effectively introduced into a system in which competition, the pursuit of self-interest, and the outcomes achieved in markets are considered to be undesirable. If nobody should receive a level of care that is not equally available to everybody else, we really can't have individuals and institutions trying to demonstrate that they are better than other individuals or institutions. And what is the point of providing more and better information to consumers if consumer choice itself is not encouraged and respected? There's no point identifying a good doctor or a good hospital if you are compelled to attend a particular hospital or doctor on geographic grounds or because you're part of a capitation system. Clearly, therefore, nothing much will change as a result of reforms that don't challenge the underlying philosophical and economic basis of the existing system. The obvious response to all these difficulties is not to try to tweak the existing system, but to return to a genuinely market-based system for the delivery of healthcare. But how would you go about doing that? We could not, for example, depend for much assistance from the medical profession. Doctors have always been covered by a code of ethics that has made it difficult to argue against free healthcare. This code casts them in the role of servants who are ethically obliged to care for the sick, irrespective of their character, the nature or cause of their illness, or their ability to pay. Doctors are not meant to care about money. So when, for example, the AMA calls for an increase in rebates or fees, it always claims that the increase is sought not to protect the financial interests of doctors, but so that the interests of patients can be protected. It's also always been difficult for the profession to argue against a state monopoly in healthcare delivery and for professional independence when medical professionals themselves have always been dependent upon government to secure their own monopoly on service provision. Most doctors not only believe that the licensing system is actually beneficial to consumers, but they've always been indoctrinated with the view that the pursuit of individual self-interest is necessarily harmful to the whole, and that there's something special about the practice of medicine that makes it inappropriate to apply to it the kinds of values that are generally considered acceptable elsewhere. Patients are especially vulnerable, or so it is argued, in an unequal power position and highly dependent on trust, particularly in circumstances in which they may be dealing with complex questions, confused or even unconscious. According to the AMA, competition works in an adversarial rather than a cooperative paradigm. Markets, says the AMA, derive their moral values purely from the pursuit of profits. They are devoid of charity or compassion. They threaten standards, and the self-interested behaviour of those working in them must inevitably undermine the kind of trust that is necessary for an effective doctor-patient relationship. This lack of understanding about behaviour in markets has inevitably led to a reliance on government to solve professional problems. The official policy stance of the AMA is constructive engagement with government, and it, along with almost every other medical, political or educational body, has assumed a role as a lobby group intent on obtaining a fair share of the spoils for its members. The AMA now spends a great deal of its time lobbying government about social issues, mental and Indigenous health, substance abuse, the health effects of climate change, and better health care for asylum seekers and refugees. And when it does so, it almost invariably adopts a perspective sympathetic to the views of the left. And as the AMA that is the most vociferous supporter of the many attacks on free choice and personal responsibility that are associated with the collectivist concept of public health. According to the AMA, every adverse health effect should have its matching regulatory control. We also now have a generation of medical practitioners who have no experience of practice before the introduction of a taxpayer-funded scheme. The interview process for medical school entry that looks for empathy and altruism, the decreased acceptability of holding and expressing free market views at university, and an increase in the number of bureaucratic and academic positions open to doctors are some of the factors that have led to an increased flow into the profession of graduates who are sympathetic to the centralised control of healthcare and actually approve of the system in which they are required to practice. These are the people who in academic, organisational and committee roles actively assist government in progressing the socialist vision for the delivery of healthcare. Many doctors like the current system because it ensures they have little in the way of bad debts. They don't have to compete so hard for patients. Don't have to worry much about doing house calls. And they've done very well financially, since, as we all know, most of the benefits of the welfare state go to those people providing the services rather than to the poor. Most doctors also like the idea of a centralised system that protects people from harm by using the power of the state to limit their choices. The fact that doctors' fees or a significant portion of them are guaranteed also relieves them of the difficulty of distinguishing between the worthy and unworthy poor, and of being personally responsible for funding their own charitable actions. It's much easier to fall into step with the view that access to health care is a right if that right must be serviced by the government rather than by the individual practitioner. This is the idea behind Brian Kaplan's claim that democracy fails not because the political process allows people to pursue their own interests at everybody else's expense, but because the process makes altruism cheap. Voting to raise your taxes by $1,000, says Kaplan, when your probability of decisiveness is 1 in 100,000, has an expected cost of a penny. The psychological benefits of unselfish voting will always exceed the material costs when the unselfish vote has no effect on the outcome. Unselfish irrational voting, says Kaplan, is actually much worse for the democratic process than selfish irrational voting. When unselfish voters are wrong about a particular economic policy, their unselfishness keeps them marching in formation, enabling them to rapidly approach their destination. In contrast, if selfish voters misunderstand the world, dissension persists, and they move forward less rapidly or not at all. In any event, we could not suddenly revert to a system of markets after so many years with a government-run scheme. There is the problem, for example, of the uninsurable, where it is now too late to protect against their known or inevitable illnesses. Jane Orient has suggested that about 1% of the non-elderly population is currently medically uninsurable, since they suffer from conditions that make their liability to costs more or less certain. There would need to be some alternative arrangements made for these people and possibly for some others in the transition to a fully private health insurance scheme. And then there are the enormous political difficulties of taking away things whose delivery has been promised. No political party that seeks electoral success rather than a purely intellectual presence, for example, could offer a health policy that did not include at least some sort of taxpayer-funded safety net. An important feature of healthcare delivery is the almost limitless costs that would be involved in providing everybody with access to the best of everything. Politicians will not admit, of course, that they cannot live up to the expectations that they have implanted, and they attempt to constrain costs by making people queue for what is available and by making an increasingly large number of things simply unavailable. Efforts to keep people away from the more expensive services by, for example, concentrating on prevention rather than cure, have produced neither the health benefits nor the cost savings anticipated. They've also resulted in what has been called reverse insurance, where individuals are protected against the small cost events that would bankrupt nobody, but where it is impossible for most people to gain adequate protection against high cost events. Expenditure on medical services versus hospital services has actually risen from a ratio of nearly 1 to 5 in 1967-68 to 1 to 2 now. The system overprovides, that is, to the healthy and underprovides to the sick. Considerable pressure is also being created on governments as new and higher cost treatments are discovered and as the population ages. In the US, 85% of the individual healthcare costs occur in the last 2 years of life, and around 25% of Medicare funds are spent on 5 to 6% of enrollees who die within a year of the expenditure. The higher profile recently given to the euthanasia lobby and the popularity of advanced directives in hospitals has not been driven by government's sudden appreciation of the benefits of freedom of choice. Real difficulties are being created in public hospitals when beds are occupied by people who, along with their relatives, have been led to believe that they have an insurance policy, that they will be kept alive for as long as possible, irrespective of the costs. The rhetoric of rights to healthcare encourages people to believe that they can avoid considerations of cost effectiveness. The percentage of total hours spent in intensive care units by patients over 80, which is a crude proxy for inappropriate care, rose from about 2.5% in 1985 to 9% in 2005. The cost in 2009 for an ICU bed was around $75,000 a day. It might be thought, therefore, that governments would now be more willing to accept genuine free market solutions to their current difficulties. They ought, for example, to be more willing to privatise the public hospital system and free up the health insurance industry, to do away with community rating and permit and encourage the development of health savings accounts, and even allow those who are prepared to take this kind of insurance to opt out of Medicare. But ideology runs deep, and politicians and bureaucrats are reluctant to let go of any of the power they've accrued. What they're actually doing is increasing the number and variety of their interventions to try to remedy the effects of previous interventions, and of course thinking up new ways to bribe voters, with the NDIS being a prime example. On the other hand, while voters often do all they can to avoid the power of the state when organising their own lives, otherwise, it's only dimly appreciated that there should be some constraint on the power and reach of government in general. Private individuals and groups also often don't want to give up the possibility of obtaining benefits for which they think somebody else will pay. It may be thought that as the quantum of money to be redistributed falls and the numbers to whom it is redistributed increase, the beneficiaries themselves might at some point put a hold on the transfers, on the grounds that any further increase in redistributions will make their own positions worse. But as you all know, this is to suppose that what is good for the collective will be translated back into what is good for the individual. While it would be better for the collective if nobody lobbied for any increase in transfers, may still pay a special interest group to lobby for an increase in its transfer and its share of whatever gains remain. This is one of the scenarios being played out in Europe today. This information is also rife so that people still believe that without the state, worthwhile causes will not attract support, the deserving poor will be left to fend for themselves, and the ignorant will be able to make choices which will cause them great harm. People are told and believe that outcomes reached in markets are unfair and unjust, and that government ought to have the power to overrule them. Consumers may be aware of the presence of extensive waiting lists for medical care and often hear about the unnecessary and increasingly common adverse effects that occur in public facilities, but they don't understand how care is actually rationed in public systems, how private insurers are prevented from offering a full range of products, or how much money is being wasted, or how they would fare under different arrangements. They have no experience of any alternative system, and they don't know that one is possible. And so they believe that the deficiencies of the welfare state can be corrected by simply fine-tuning existing arrangements. In my view, healthcare is the field in which the welfare state is probably most firmly entrenched and is most likely to be most resistant to change. Remember that while the British Conservative government under Thatcher was able to denationalise the coal and steel industry, it left the NHS intact. I also notice that this organisation has no health policy, although it says at one point in its comparative federalism policy that it would cease all government involvement in health and education. Good luck with that on the stump. We are not likely, therefore, to see a return to free markets in medicine without a much wider winding back of the welfare state elsewhere. And I am very pessimistic about the prospects of that occurring, although that may be seen as the bitter moaning of somebody who spent 40 years in the trenches to see things get progressively worse. It is difficult, in my view, to disagree with de Giasse's conclusions that the logical end of the line for democratic government is unlimited popular sovereignty, bare majority rule, and the erosion of obstacles that could prevent collective choice from overriding private choice. Effectively, this is a situation in which the majority will always prevail and all rights will be transferred to the state. Even if I'm wrong, it's a problem for any successful gradualist approach that the greater the extent to which libertarian goals are reached, the less will be the incentive for moving further in that direction. And this is the problem that now confronts us with the popularity of market socialism and the view that some minor adjustments in the current system are all that is required. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We have time for probably one question if anybody wants to raise any comments.
You're right, we don't have a health policy.
Well, I was just going to comment on that. I was one of the people who attended the Mises seminar a few weeks ago. I think it was more than three, Brian.
I missed somebody?
Yeah, there's several people here who were there. And if it's any consolation, your presentation there had an effect on me, if not nobody else. And I started writing a health policy, but I kept thinking I should probably talk to Brian about this. So, and in fact, that was what prompted me to ring Brian. Brian is a long-standing LDP member, hint, hint, Cass Wilkinson, and for which obviously we're grateful. I twisted Brian's arm when Paul Nuttall pulled out of his trip to Australia. We thought, what a great opportunity to invite one of our members who's also, well, he's been battling, as he said, in the trenches and is disappointed in results, and I don't blame him. But it's a worthy cause. We don't have a detailed health policy. We need one. And if any of you feel motivated to help me write one, now's a good chance. I'm really delighted that Brian was able to step into the breach and come on and talk about an issue which we do need to address as a party. And thank you very much, Brian, once again.